Valens society had changed dramatically from when they lived in the Sicarian Peninsula before the collapse of the Western Empire. For decades before the collapse, the Valens were faithful to the Respian Empire and fought on the front lines to keep the empire's borders without much gain for themselves. The Valens were looked down on as one of the weaker barbarian tribes within the empire, but they still got the job done. Any notion of duty to the empire went away when Varith led his Somms down to conquer the whole of the Sicarian Peninsula in 472. The Valens were led by King Eric, and Eric himself had been at the head of the Valan forces during their time defending the empire. In his tenure under Respa, Eric had gained this reputation for being of a cowardly breed. Eric tended to retreat too quickly or just flat out refuse to engage if he thought victory wasn't assured. The makeup of the Valan forces parroted this philosophy, being mostly comprised of auxiliary troops rather than frontline fighters. And to their credit, the Valan archers and skirmishers were renowned throughout the Empire, with a number of these Valan archers being employed as mercenaries across the Metaxagus Sea. That is to say that once King Eric heard about Varith trying to convince the Somms, who were more or less the exact opposite of the Valens, as the Somms were these strong and hardy warriors, to go and conquer Zacharia for themselves, that King Eric fled back to Zacharia as soon as possible. The former members of the Otrith tribe, who were another tribe with land grants in Zacharia, that had remained loyal to Respa, got folded into the Valens as well, but it wasn't a huge amount. Estimates are that around anywhere from 5 to 10% of the Valens were made up of former Otrith. Now, as his reputation would suggest, King Eric immediately started planning the Valens' retreat from Zacharia once he arrived. The Valan territory was the southern third portion of the peninsula, which worked out well for Eric since his territory had all of the ports and anchorages. The Valens basically commandeered a giant fleet of just fishing and merchant ships with a decent amount of Respian naval ships they were able to capture before the docked navy sailed off to the Isserine Islands off the coast of Zacharia in retreat. King Eric then went on to conquer the islands off the coast of Zacharia. This event was a psychological 180 for many of the Valens, as the islands just immediately surrendered to Eric. The Respians didn't even fight for themselves, they just gave in. Even the naval ships that fled to these islands just threw in the towel immediately. The Valens now saw that the once mighty Respian Empire wasn't actually carved in stone. It was just one big smoke show. The Respians weren't willing to actually preserve it. Coupled with the excess of new naval vessels and expertise the Valens had just captured in taking the Isserine Islands, and they were chomping at the bit to squeeze all of the juice they could out of Respa. Eric himself was overcome by an illness soon after taking the islands. Some scholars believe he was poisoned by a disgruntled Respian, but either way, he recovered over the course of a couple weeks. While this might not seem like a long time, it was more than enough time for the eager Valens to just start sailing off and conquering more islands for themselves, along with doing a large amount of piracy. During his illness, King Eric had a vision of Bishop Furius, who was the founder of Furianism, which was an early sect of Kilnicism that many of the Stomach tribes subscribed to, including the Valens. In his visions, King Eric saw Furius commanding him to go forth and conquer his former homelands in the name of Kiln. Furius's homeland being the province of Akros, in the north of Akros. After he recovered, Eric gathered up the remaining Valens and sailed directly to the heart of Akros, Olko. To the credit of the Respians, the garrisons in Olko initially held out in a siege against the Valens, but since they were basically at the heart of the empire, they weren't very well supplied in terms of defenses. Their frontier was just an endless sea of desert after all, so it wasn't very long until the Valens broke into Olko. From there, Eric went hopping from town to town until all of Akros gave up and surrendered to the Valens. It was after the conquest of Akros that King Eric began to really step into his role as more of a religious figure. He started with appointing his own bishop, Bishop Catero, in the old monastery where the late Bishop Furius had lived, and had this bishop bless him and his closest men, while shutting off anyone else from receiving these blessings. As the Valens became wealthier and wealthier from their pirating, it became a common practice to bribe Eric with their plunder to receive blessings from Bishop Catero. It was also here in Olco that King Eric put the brakes on his conquests, and instead began focusing on building up his new capital and holy city. Much like when King Eric was sick on the islands, most of the Valens still wanted to continue devouring the entirety of the Metaxagus Sea, and so that's exactly what they did. In the following weeks, the islands west of Behia had fallen to these independent Valen marauders, and it was really after this that the Valens officially owned the western Metaxagus Sea. All of the islands west of Behia were controlled by the Valens to some degree, and they had either destroyed or captured Respa's western navy. After this, the Valens got extra cocky, and instead of just nabbing up all of the islands, they decided to go for actual mainland territory. It was a bit of a debate amongst the Valens at the time, since there was this island to the east of Behia called Codenia, which the Valens very well could have taken at this time. It just would have taken a bit of a combined effort, since it was better fortified than the western islands. Compare this to southern Behia, where the Carmani were legally in control at this point, but all of their forces were in and around Respa and the northern borders. The easy conquest of southern Behia proved too tempting for the Valens, and so they began carving it up. The Valens didn't get too far before the Carmani came to put a stop to them, but they were pretty evenly matched, and so the two sides stalemated until the Somms came through and kicked out the Carmani in 473. The Somms were a lot stronger than the Carmani were, and so they were able to slowly chip away at the Valens for the next couple years until the Valens were fully kicked out of Behia in 475. This is also when the fleeing Valens from Behia arrived, just in time to reinforce Akros for an oncoming invasion from the eastern Respins. And under the leadership of King Eric, the Valens demolished the invading Respins and destroyed their navy. From this point, the Valens really became the only naval force in the whole of the Metaxagus Sea. While they were still pretty beat up from the events in 475, the Valens immediately got back to pirating, though. Since they had destroyed the Eastern Empire's navy, they started to focus a lot more on pirating the East, since that's where most of the riches were flowing in from to begin with. King Eric also gave his royal decree soon afterwards, which encouraged the Valens to go out and enslave the Chaldean Respins of the East. The Chaldeans were the mainline Respin sect of Calnistism. These slaves were then used in the construction of the Olco Cathedral, while the funding for it came from the Valens' pirated wealth. The island of Codenia continued to be an object of desire for King Eric, along with the Valens themselves. Numerous attempts were made over the following years by independent Valens to conquer Codenia, but the Codenians were always too tenacious for the Valens. Codenia was littered with these small castles, which they used to hold off and spread the Valens' focus. If the Valens took any of these small stone forts, they would be forced to retreat due to lack of supplies, since the Codenians made sure not to leave anything behind. By 480, Eric had finished the construction of a brand new fleet for the invasion of Codenia. But before he could see to the sending off of the Valens to conquer the island, he received a messenger from the king of the Folok inside of Zacharia. The Folok were promising to recognize Bishop Catero as the true head of the church, in return for Eric's assistance in fighting the Visisoms. Now the decision was left on King Eric's head. And that's the question for this installment of Kyltin Chronicles. Will King Eric decide to invade Codenia, or will he help his Folok brothers in a war against the Visisoms? You can vote now in the comments below and by voting in the community post. Thank you for watching. And until next time, have a lovely day.